The Supreme Court has just dropped a legal bombshell, a major ruling on gun possession that could change the Second Amendment forever. This isn't just another court decision. This is the kind of moment that defines generations. For decades, Americans have fought over where the line between freedom and regulation truly lies, and now, the nation's highest court may have just redrawn that line completely. Is this the moment where the Constitution is finally restored to its original intent, or has the court just rewritten the very meaning of your right to bear arms? The stakes couldn't be higher, and the implications stretch far beyond this single case. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to break down will show you exactly how this ruling could reshape the future of gun ownership, the law, and the balance of American liberty itself. Here is what we know right now. In a decisive 7-2 ruling that came down just days ago, the Supreme Court has fundamentally redefined gun possession rights under the Second Amendment in a way that expands constitutional protections far beyond what most legal analysts predicted. The majority opinion, joined by 7 justices, strikes at the heart of how federal and state governments have been regulating who can possess firearms and under what circumstances. Breaking news alerts lit up phones across America as the decision was published, with graphics showing the marble columns of the Supreme Court building and the gavel coming down on restrictions that have stood for years. This is not a narrow technical ruling that only lawyers will understand. This is a sweeping constitutional pronouncement that changes the rules for millions of Americans and puts countless federal and state laws in immediate jeopardy. The speed and clarity with which the court spoke has left government officials reeling and gun rights advocates celebrating what many are calling a watershed moment in the fight to preserve the Second Amendment as the founders intended. To understand why this decision is so monumental, you need to know the background of the case that brought us here. This legal challenge was brought by individuals who had been prohibited from possessing firearms under federal law based on circumstances that they argued had nothing to do with whether they actually posed a danger to others. The law being challenged imposed sweeping possession bans that stripped the right to bear arms from entire categories of people, often for life and often without any individualized determination of whether those specific individuals were actually threats. Gun rights advocates argued that these blanket prohibitions violated the core constitutional right recognized in landmark cases like Heller, which held that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess firearms for self-defense, and Bruin, which established that gun regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. The question before the Supreme Court was whether federal limits on gun possession align with the Second Amendment's original intent and historical meaning, or whether Congress and federal agencies have been imposing restrictions that the Constitution simply does not allow. Lower courts had been divided, with some judges upholding the prohibitions as reasonable public safety measures and others striking them down as unconstitutional infringements on fundamental rights. The stage was set for the Supreme Court to issue a definitive ruling, and what the justices decided has sent shockwaves through the entire legal system. In language that will be quoted in courtrooms and cited in legal briefs for decades, the Supreme Court's majority opinion makes crystal clear that the right to possess firearms extends far beyond the narrow interpretations that government lawyers have been pushing for years. The court held that the Second Amendment protects not just a theoretical right that can be regulated into near meaninglessness, but a robust constitutional guarantee that limits what the government can do when it comes to disarming citizens. The majority explained that blanket possession bans based on broad categorical exclusions are inconsistent with the historical tradition of firearms regulation in America, and that when the government wants to strip someone of their Second Amendment rights, it must have a much stronger justification rooted in actual historical practice than simply declaring that a particular category of people is too dangerous to be trusted with guns.
This is a constitutional shift of the highest order, not just a policy tweak or a minor adjustment to how courts balance interests. The decision reaffirms that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right that receives the same rigorous protection as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and other liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights. The court rejected the notion that gun rights are somehow second-class rights that governments can restrict based on contemporary policy preferences rather than constitutional constraints. 7 justices looked at the federal possession restrictions and said that they go too far, that they are not justified by historical tradition, and that they cannot stand under a proper understanding of what the Second Amendment means. The implications are staggering because this reasoning applies not just to the specific law challenged in this case, but to countless other federal and state possession restrictions that rely on similar categorical bans. The reaction from the Department of Justice and from politicians across the country has been swift and reveals the deep fault lines that continue to divide America on the question of gun rights. Within hours of the decision being published, the DOJ issued a statement calling the ruling deeply concerning and warning that it could undermine decades of federal firearms policy designed to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous individuals. Justice Department officials are already huddling with lawyers to figure out which of their enforcement priorities are now in jeopardy and how they might restructure their approach to survive constitutional scrutiny under this new precedent. Some lawmakers, particularly those who have built their political careers on advocating for gun control, are expressing outrage and calling for legislative action to counteract what they view as a reckless judicial decision that prioritizes gun rights over public safety. But pro-Second Amendment groups and the lawmakers who represent millions of gun owners are telling a completely different story. They're calling this a long-awaited victory for freedom, a restoration of constitutional principles that have been trampled by overreaching government bureaucrats and politicians who view the Second Amendment as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a right to be respected. These advocates are mobilizing to use this precedent to challenge other possession restrictions, to defend individuals who have been prosecuted under laws that may no longer be constitutional, and to push back against state and local governments that continue to treat gun ownership as a privilege rather than a right. The battle lines are drawn, and the clash between those who see this as a triumph of constitutional law and those who see it as a dangerous mistake is only intensifying. Now let's talk about what this actually means for you, for your family, and for gun owners in every corner of this country. This ruling could invalidate certain possession bans that have prevented law-abiding Americans from exercising their Second Amendment rights based on circumstances that have nothing to do with actual danger or criminal intent. If you or someone you know has been told that you can never possess a firearm again because of a decades-old conviction, a civil commitment, or some other categorical disqualifier, this decision opens the door to challenging that prohibition and potentially restoring your constitutional rights. This could alter permit rules that have given government officials discretionary power to decide who gets to exercise a constitutional right and who doesn't. It could reshape state-level carry laws by calling into question the justifications that states have been using to restrict who can lawfully possess and carry firearms. These effects are not theoretical or far off. In the future, they start immediately in several states where possession laws relied on the exact kind of categorical bans that the Supreme Court has now called into question. Gun owners who have been living under the cloud of restrictions that treat them as presumptively dangerous simply because they fall into a broad category now have powerful ammunition to fight back in court. Lawyers representing individuals charged with possession violations are already filing motions to dismiss based on this new precedent. The practical impact on everyday Americans is profound, because this is about whether you can defend yourself and your family, whether you can exercise a constitutional right without the government second-guessing, whether you really need it, and whether the Constitution actually protects you or just offers empty promises that bureaucrats can ignore whenever they decide public safety requires it.
The public reaction and media coverage of this decision perfectly encapsulate the cultural and political divide that defines modern America's gun debate. Mainstream media outlets have been running headlines expressing shock and concern, with commentators warning that the ruling could lead to more guns in the hands of people who shouldn't have them and questioning whether the Supreme Court has prioritized ideology over common sense. Television talking heads are debating whether this represents judicial activism run amok, with some legal analysts who disagree with the decision claiming that the court has departed from sound constitutional interpretation. But if you look at what Second Amendment advocates and gun owners themselves are saying, you see a completely different narrative. Social media is exploding with celebration, with gun rights activists calling this one of the most important victories in the history of the modern Second Amendment movement. Videos analyzing the decision are being shared millions of times, with passionate commentary about what it means to finally have a Supreme Court that takes gun rights seriously and refuses to let the government chip away at constitutional protections one restriction at a time. Online forums dedicated to firearms and constitutional rights are filled with discussions about which laws can now be challenged, which enforcement actions should be contested, and how this precedent can be used to roll back decades of incremental infringement. The contrast between mainstream media outrage and Second Amendment community celebration could not be more stark. It's as if two different countries are reacting to two completely different events. Tweets and statements from prominent figures on both sides are lighting up screens, with some calling this a dark day for America and others calling it a bright new dawn for constitutional liberty. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, what becomes clear is that this ruling is about far more than just the technical question of who can possess firearms under what circumstances. This is a statement about government power, about individual rights, and about the legacy of the founders who wrote the Second Amendment into the Bill of Rights because they understood that an armed citizenry is the ultimate check on tyranny. This decision reaffirms that the Constitution is not a living document that means whatever judges or politicians want it to mean at any given moment. It's a binding legal charter with real enforceable limits on what the government can do to restrict the freedoms of the people. The Supreme Court is telling us that when the founders used the phrase, "the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," they meant something real and substantive, not a suggestion that can be regulated away whenever public opinion or political winds shift in favor of more control. This isn't just a legal win for gun owners. It's a constitutional affirmation that individual rights matter more than bureaucratic convenience, that historical meaning matters more than contemporary policy preferences, and that the American tradition of limited government and expansive individual liberty is still alive and enforceable through the courts. The patriotic significance of this moment cannot be overstated because it represents the constitutional system working as designed, with the judiciary serving as a check on legislative and executive overreach and protecting the rights of citizens even when powerful government institutions want to take those rights away. Of course, the opposition to this ruling is fierce and the political fallout is only beginning. Blue states are already moving to counter this Supreme Court decision, with some governors and state attorneys general announcing that they will find alternative legal frameworks to preserve as many possession restrictions as possible while technically complying with the new constitutional standard. Legislative sessions are being called to rewrite statutes in ways that lawmakers hope will survive judicial review under the precedent the Supreme Court has established. Gun control advocacy organizations are fundraising off this decision, warning their supporters that the court has opened the floodgates and that urgent action is needed to prevent what they characterize as a public safety catastrophe. Some politicians are even talking about more extreme measures like court packing or constitutional amendments to overturn what the Supreme Court has done. But legal experts across the ideological spectrum are saying that the Supreme Court's message is crystal clear and that attempts to evade or undermine this ruling through clever legislative drafting or administrative workarounds are unlikely to succeed in the long run. The court has established a clear constitutional test rooted in historical tradition, and laws that fail that test will be struck down no matter how politicians try to repackage them. This is going to be an ongoing political battle with high stakes for both sides, but the constitutional framework has shifted decisively in favor of a more robust understanding of Second Amendment rights, and that shift is not easily reversed. Looking forward, this ruling sets the stage for an avalanche of new legal challenges that will test the outer boundaries of what the Supreme Court has decided. We're going to see challenges to background check requirements that go beyond what historical tradition supports, to registration rules that treat gun owners like suspects rather than citizens exercising a constitutional right, and to federal possession limits that rely on the same kind of categorical bans the court just rejected. Defense attorneys representing individuals charged with gun possession crimes are already using this precedent to argue that their clients' prosecutions are unconstitutional. Gun rights organizations are mapping out litigation strategies to systematically challenge restrictive laws in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, knowing that they now have powerful Supreme Court precedent on their side. The Department of Justice and state prosecutors will be forced to either abandon enforcement of laws that can no longer be defended under this new constitutional standard, or continue to pursue cases and risk having those laws struck down one by one in court. This is the beginning of a new chapter in Second Amendment jurisprudence, not the end of the story, and the legal battles ahead will determine whether this ruling's promise of restored constitutional rights becomes a reality for millions of Americans or gets bogged down in endless litigation and resistance from governments unwilling to accept what the Supreme Court has said. The Second Amendment has just been redefined in ways that will echo through American law and American life for generations. And gun owners everywhere need to understand what's coming next. This is a moment of constitutional significance that rivals the most important Supreme Court decisions in our nation's history. The court has spoken with clarity and force, establishing that the right to possess firearms is a real and enforceable constitutional guarantee that governments cannot simply regulate away based on broad policy concerns detached from historical tradition. But this victory comes with a responsibility. The responsibility to stay informed, to remain vigilant, and to defend the ground that has been won against the inevitable counterattacks from those who view this decision as a threat rather than a restoration of constitutional principles. Share this video with every gun owner you know, with every American who cares about the Constitution, and with everyone who needs to understand how profoundly the legal landscape has just shifted. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss an update on the legal developments, the political battles, and the real-world implications of this historic ruling. Leave a comment telling me what this decision means to you and how you think it will change the future of gun rights in America. This is only the beginning of a new fight, a new chapter, and a new era in the ongoing struggle to preserve the freedoms that define us as a nation. Stay alert, stay informed, and never take your constitutional rights for granted, because the price of liberty is eternal vigilance and the cost of complacency is the gradual erosion of everything the founders fought to secure. God bless you, God bless the Second Amendment, and God bless the United States of America.